Hi everyone, Lee Sensei here. Today we're going to cover a fairly fun and light topic. A few people have asked me the question, can you put a bayonet on a crossbow? And this has to be one of the silliest things I've heard. It comes from Dungeons and Dragons, which alone might make you think about how historically accurate this would be. But let's entertain this idea and talk about crossbows and bayonets, and you might even learn a thing or two. The reason why this might even look practical is because we are seeing the weapon in isolation. If you have a crossbow, which you can't use as a melee weapon, and you stick on a blade, then you could use it as a melee weapon. The problem is that that's not what crossbows are meant to be used for. And when we see the context of archery and crossbows and bayonets, we'll better understand why bayonets were used for what they were used for and why they would be useless on a crossbow. Bayonets were originally used on muskets in the 17th century. Now, the original muskets were notoriously slow to load. The matchlocks and wheel-locks of the late 16th century to early 17th century, a trained musketman could take around 3 to 4 shots per minute, which is really slow. The later muskets and musket drills in the late 17th century, for example, the British Brown Bess, could be shot up to 4 to 5 rounds per minute. That's still slow compared to modern weapons, of course, and even compared to bows and crossbows, that's still a fairly slow rate of fire. Now, during this downtime, the infantry were, of course, vulnerable to enemy attacks, especially by cavalry. When the early muskets were adopted into militaries in Europe during the 16th century, they were deployed in what we might now consider to be combined arms, where different unit types worked closely together to complement each other. And the main formation used at the time was the pike and shot, where you would have units of musketmen and units of pikemen. The idea is that the musketmen would provide the firepower, and while they were reloading, the pikemen would provide defense. And again, the main threat at the time was cavalry. Cavalry could move very quickly, they could cover more ground in a short amount of time, and musketmen would be very vulnerable to cavalry if they were caught reloading. So the pikemen had a close-in defense role. The difficulty was in balancing the pikes and muskets. If you have too many pikes, your army would lose a lot of potential firepower because that's more people not using a gun. If you have too many muskets, then the army is less flexible and might be more vulnerable to counterattack. The thing is that over time, it was realized that the musket was the far more important weapon, to the point where the pikes didn't really do anything in battle apart from getting shot. And in many cases, when a musketman was killed, a pikeman would pick up the musket. The pike became a symbol of being stubborn and sticking to the traditional pike, whereas the musket was clearly the way to go. And that's what happened in history. The musket was adapted as the standard infantry weapon, and pikes were all but gone. The problem with giving everyone a musket is that everybody has a ranged weapon and nobody has a melee weapon or a close range weapon. And this is problematic, again, with dealing with cavalry, as well as fighting against other nations and armies which actually use close range weapons. And so the bayonet was adapted to allow the musketman to use the musket as an improvised spear. Now, I want to emphasize two things. First is the spear part. A musket is not that long compared to a spear, so it's definitely not a pike and definitely not a spear. It's an improvised weapon. The second thing is, it is improvised. Again, the balance and the length of the musket would not allow it to be used as a spear. In fact, the way you would drill with a bayonet would be very different to the way you fight with a spear, which the armies would later learn and develop in the later centuries. So the bayonet was effectively a way to give the infantry the ability to fight in hand-to-hand combat or melee combat. So they could both shoot at long distance and engage at the point of a bayonet, and in some army doctrines that was the preferred method. Given that it still took a long time to load, it might be shoot a volley or two and then charge with bayonet. So now that we understand the history of the bayonet and its usage in warfare, where do crossbows fit in? First, let's remember that crossbows were being phased out by the 1500s by pike and shot, and in turn, pike and shot was supplanted by the standard modern flintlock muskets with bayonets in the 1600s. So we have several degrees of separation between the crossbow and the bayonet. Also consider the support role of the crossbow. The crossbow was used as a skirmishing weapon and as a ranged weapon to support the infantry or the rest of the army. The crossbow itself was not an integral part of the armed force. Unlike a musket, which was the main source of firepower and later on the only source of firepower, the crossbow was only a small part of the army, to the point where many armies didn't even have crossbows. They would hire mercenary groups, especially from Italy. Crossbows would of course also see effective use in drawn-out battles, especially in sieges. An advantage of the crossbow is that it was actually faster to shoot a crossbow than a musket. Now, some of the really strong crossbows, which required a loading tool or a windlass to wind up, took a bit longer. But for the most part, a trained crossbowman could shoot faster and more accurately than the early muskets. However, as we said before, crossbows were only a minor part of the army and a minor part of the battle. Apart from opening the battle and providing some range support, the bulk of the fighting was done by the infantry, as it always has been. Basically, the crossbows were not integrated into medieval armies. Again, most of the fighting was done by the infantry or the cavalry. The crossbows did not need to be in the melee, and for the most part they weren't. When we get to the pike and shot era, the primary force was the musketmen, and in fact it was the pikes that supported the muskets, not the other way around. So since crossbowmen were never expected to be in the melee, they wouldn't need to use a melee weapon. Now, they might carry a sword or a knife or something for self-defense, but they wouldn't need to turn their primary weapon, the crossbow, into an improvised melee weapon, because they would never need to do so. In contrast, the musketmen of the 17th century had to fight in both ranged and melee using the same weapon. Now, we've established that historically there would be no reason for a crossbowman to mount a bayonet, but if we were to entertain this hypothetical idea, would it even work? The short answer is no. The point of the bayonet was to create an improvised weapon. You turn a musket into something resembling a spear, and as I said before, it was not a spear, it was shorter. So the reason why we see long muskets and long bayonets is to give the infantry the reach needed to fight in melee combat. On the other hand, crossbows are very short. You wouldn't have any reach advantage with a crossbow that you couldn't already achieve with a sword or, of course, a spear if you had to use one. So you wouldn't be able to keep an enemy at range with a crossbow with a pointy tip. Additionally, the crossbows were very unbalanced, especially once you start thinking about the heavy crossbows with steel prods. All the weight was at the front of the crossbow. So instead of able to control the weapon as a spear or short sword or whatever, you're basically gripping it very close to the front and just kind of pushing it forward. And that takes a lot of wind up to do an effective thrust, and you wouldn't be able to control the weapon to defend yourself. So it's a pretty useless melee weapon. And again, you couldn't accomplish something that a sword or a dagger couldn't achieve. And when you look at like movies like Arrow or the Robin Hood film, it's easy to swing around a plastic prop, but using a real crossbow is clumsy. Additionally, a bayonet would prevent the crossbow from being used as a crossbow. Now, most crossbows at the time had to be loaded by hand, and in most cases you would have to put the crossbow into the ground, and many designs had a stirrup for that reason. You would put it into the ground and then you would pull the string back up, either using your belt or using a tool or using a windlass, but you needed to put the crossbow down. It was too heavy to hold up and pull it back by hand, unless it was a very light hand crossbow. But if you couldn't stick the crossbow into the ground because you have a giant blade in the way, then you couldn't reload the weapon. And before you go, well, what about a spring-loaded telescopic bayonet which can activate with push of a button? That's some Assassin's Creed stuff right there. And again, if you want to use a blade which you can detach easily, it's called a dagger. In summary, could you mount a bayonet onto a crossbow? With enough engineering and or duct tape, yes. Would it have any purpose? No. The crossbow was too short, too bulky, too heavy, too clumsy to be used as an effective melee weapon. Why wasn't a bayonet used on a crossbow historically? Because crossbowmen were not expected to carry the battle into the melee phase. Since they weren't expected to fight in the melee, then they didn't need to adapt the weapons to fight in melee. And again, during this time, there were much better options for fighting in melee. Swords, spears, axes, maces, and so on. You didn't need to turn your crossbow or your bow into a melee weapon. So yeah, it's a fun design. It's very much a fantastical idea. If you create this fantasy scenario where a person with a crossbow had to smack or poke someone with it, then yeah, you could make it work, but it would never be a viable weapon. Anyway, this is New Sensei. Hope you found this interesting. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.